Welcome back to our deep dive series. If you're following machine learning research, you know understanding how these models work is a huge deal.
It really is, especially with neural networks often feeling like these, well, black boxes.
Exactly. So today, we're digging into a pretty cool paper that proposes a new way to peek inside. It's about combining different ways of explaining what's going on, these sort of high-level causal models.
Right. The challenge being that we want to know why a network makes a specific decision, not just that it made it.
And this research promises maybe a more accurate, more nuanced way to figure that out. Less guesswork, hopefully.
Let's hope so. It tackles a known issue. Our current explanations often only capture part of the picture.
Okay, so the paper we're looking at is called Combining Causal Models for More Accurate Abstractions of Neural Networks. It's from a causal learning conference, CELAR 2025, authors Pustlar, Maglia Cain, and Geiger.
And right away, they state this core problem. Current causal explanations or abstractions are often only partially faithful, meaning they don't fully match what the network's actually doing internally.
So what's their solution?
Well, instead of trying to find one perfect explanation, they propose combining several simpler ones. The clever part is that different explanations might activate depending on the input the network gets.
So the network might use different strategies or run different internal algorithms depending on the task or the specific data point.
Exactly. It allows for a more dynamic view. And they explore this trade-off, between how many inputs your explanation covers, they call this strength, and how accurate that explanation actually is, it's faithfulness.
Faithfulness. How do they measure that?
They use something called Interchange Intervention Accuracy, or IIA. Basically, it checks if making changes based on your explanation leads to the expected results in the network.
Got it. So higher IIA means a more trustworthy explanation. And they want strong explanations covering lots of inputs, but also high faithfulness.
Right. Find the strongest hypothesis you can, given a certain minimum level of faithfulness you're willing to accept. Oh, and for anyone interested, the code is up on GitHub too.
Good to know. Okay, let's dive into the paper itself.
Mm-hmm.
They start by acknowledging, the progress in mechanistic interpretability, things like causal mediation, causal abstraction.
Yeah, the field has come a long way in trying to map out the mechanisms inside these networks.
But they argue quantifying how good these maps are, how faithful, is still a major hurdle. And that's where their core idea comes in. If one map isn't enough, maybe combine several. They introduce this formal combine operation for causal models.
It lets you build these more expressive hypotheses, essentially saying, okay, if the input looks like this, the network is probably doing computation A, but if it looks like that, it switches to computation B.
So it moves beyond a single static explanation.
Precisely. It allows the causal structure itself to sort of adapt based on the input, reflecting that neural networks might not just follow one rigid algorithm all the time.
Okay, that makes sense. They provide some background too, right, on mechanistic interpretability.
They do. They touch on analyzing distributed representations, how concepts might be spread across many neurons, mentioning things like distributed alignment search, sparse autoencoders, tools we use to find patterns.
And intervention techniques, like activation patching.
Exactly. Stuff like path patching, causal scrubbing, ways to experimentally test our hypotheses by actually fiddling with the network's internals. They also nod to findings in vision and language models, circuits people have found.
It sounds like the field's really matured, moving towards more rigorous evaluation.
Definitely. There's a push for better theoretical frameworks and solid ways to measure how good our explanations are. This isn't just about waving hands anymore.
Then there's this concept of faithfulness again. They really stress its importance.
Yeah, they define it as how well your explanation actually mirrors the network's true reasoning process. It's not just about predicting the output, it's about matching the internal steps.
Which is crucial for high-stakes stuff, like medical AI or self-driving cars. You need to trust the reasoning.
Absolutely. But it's hard, right? Because we don't usually know the ground truth, the actual internal process, especially for these massive networks.
True. Okay, so they lay some groundwork with formal definitions too. Causal models, interventions.
Yes, they get formal. They define a deterministic causal model, variables, functions describing relationships, inputs, outputs. They talk about interventions, specifically hard interventions, where you just replace a part of the process with a fixed value.
And this exact transformation idea.
Yes, that's key. It's a formal way to say that two different models, maybe a simple algorithm and the complex network, are fundamentally representing the same causal process, just maybe at different levels of detail.
Like a blueprint versus the actual building?
Kinda, yeah. It helps formalize when a simplified explanation is truly compatible with the complex reality. They also mention constructive causal abstraction, which is a specific method for building these high-level explanations by grouping together low-level parts of the network.
Okay, so the overall goal of mechanistic interpretability using this framework is like reverse engineering the algorithm the network learned.
Pretty much. You represent your hypothesis about the algorithm as a high-level causal model. You represent the network as a low-level one, and you look for that exact transformation to see if they match up.
How do you find that match in practice?
Well, you need to figure out how the network represents things internally featureize the hidden states. Then you use your high-level model almost like a guide to learn a mapping, often a linear transformation, connecting the network's activity patterns to the concepts in your algorithm.
Makes sense. And they use interchange interventions to test this.
Right, especially distributed interchange interventions, or DII. These let you test hypotheses about concepts that might be represented across many neurons, not just one. You basically swap representations between different inputs and see if the output changes as your hypothesized model predicts.
And distributed alignment search, DAS, helps find those representations.
Exactly. DAS is an algorithm that tries to find the best linear subspace, the best combination of neuron activities that corresponds to a variable in your high-level model by optimizing based on the results of these DIIs. They even give the loss function it minimizes.
Okay, but they also admit these transformations are usually approximate, right? Not perfect.
Yes, in practice, it's rarely a perfect match. And that's where interchange intervention accuracy, IIA, comes back in. It quantifies how approximate the match is.
So IIA is the score, the measure of faithfulness. What percentage of the interventions actually worked as expected?
Precisely. It's their main metric for judging how good, how faithful any given explanation or abstraction is.
Right. So to make this concrete, they used a simple example, adding numbers.
Yeah, a really clear test case. They fine-tuned a small GPT-2 model to add 3 numbers, like x plus y plus z. Simple, but lets them test things carefully.
And they came up with different hypotheses for how the model might be doing it?
Exactly. 5 different causal models. 1 where it doesn't add at all, just keeps x, y, z separate. 3 where it does partial sums, like just x plus y or y plus z or x plus z. And 1 where it calculates the full sum x plus y plus z.
So 5 distinct potential algorithms.
And they use DAS to see how well each of these hypotheses explain the network's activity across different layers.
And what did they find, looking at figure 1 in the paper?
It's quite revealing. Early layers. High IIA for just representing the separate numbers x, y, z. Makes sense. It hasn't done the math yet. The final sum model, MXYZ, gets basically a perfect accuracy across all layers, which you'd expect since the model was trained to get the right answer.
Okay, but the interesting part is the middle layers.
That's where it gets nuanced. The partial sum models, MXY, MYZ, MXZ, show intermediate IIA scores, not perfect, not 0. It suggests the network is sort of partially representing these intermediate steps.
Like the calculations in progress.
Kind of, and notably, MXY, summing the first 2, often has slightly higher IIA than the others, which they think might be because of how GPT-2's causal attention works. It naturally focuses on earlier parts of the sequence.
So the big takeaway from this preliminary test is
that in those middle layers, a single model isn't telling the whole story. The network seems to be representing different quantities to some degree, perhaps depending on the specific input numbers. It motivates the need for something more flexible.
Which leads right into their main proposal, combining these models.
Exactly. If interpreting the results of a single model with partial faithfulness is hard, maybe we can get a clearer picture by explicitly allowing the explanation to switch between models.
They formalize this as combined causal models. How does that work?
Basically, you partition the input space. You say, for inputs in set A, use model 1. For inputs in set B, use model 2, and so on. The overall mechanism of the combined model becomes this piecewise function that activates different base models depending on where the input falls.
Can you give the example they used with the addition task?
Sure. They imagine combining, say, MXY sum x plus y, MYZ sum y plus z, and MXYZ full sum. Maybe the combined model uses MXY if x is small, MYZ if y is small, but x isn't, and MXYZ otherwise. It's just an illustration, but it shows how the combined model represents different strategies.
Okay, I see. And this brings us back to that faithfulness-strength trade-off.
Right. They define strength formally now, essentially as the proportion of inputs that your combined model can explain using one of the meaningful base models, not just a trivial do-nothing model.
So strength is coverage. How much of the input space does your explanation handle?
Exactly. And the goal of combining models is to achieve higher strength for any given level of required faithfulness. IIA. You want to explain more inputs more accurately?
How do they actually build these combined models? Do they retrain everything?
No, cleverly, they reuse the alignments they already learned for the individual models using DAS. The main challenge becomes figuring out how to partition the input space, which inputs go with which model.
And they use these evaluation graphs.
Yeah, that's a neat idea. Before combining, they pre-compute the faithfulness, IIA, of each individual model for every possible input, or a representative sample. You can visualize this as a graph where nodes are inputs, and edges between inputs assigned to the same model are weighted by how well that model works for both.
Yeah, so the graph encodes how well each simple explanation works everywhere.
Pretty much. And then they use an algorithm too in the paper to greedily build the input partition. You set a minimum faithfulness threshold, say lambda 0.95. The algorithm then tries to assign inputs to models in a way that maximizes the overall strength coverage while ensuring the average faithfulness for the inputs assigned to any single model stays above that threshold.
It's like trying to cover as much ground as possible with your explanations, but without letting the quality of any single explanation drop too low.
That's a good way to put it. It's a greedy approach, so maybe not perfectly optimal, but practical.
And they tested this on GPT-2 small again.
Yes, fine-tuned on the arithmetic task and also a Boolean logic task.
Let's look at the arithmetic results first. Layer 7, figure 2.
Right. So they compare the strength they can achieve with individual models versus combined models at different faithfulness thresholds, lambda, the key result. The combined models consistently achieve higher strength, especially at high faithfulness levels.
So if you demand, say, 95% faithfulness, you can explain a much larger fraction of the inputs by combining models like MXY and MYZ than you could with just MXY or just MYZ alone.
Exactly. Combining allows you to capture the inputs where MXY works well and the inputs where MYZ works well, leading to greater overall strength without sacrificing that high accuracy bar. The full combination of all models does even better.
Okay, and the Boolean logic task, what was that?
It involved unary and binary operators like not A and D or X star on Boolean inputs. There were 64 possible inputs in total. They hypothesized a couple of ways the network might solve it, maybe directly evaluating the expression or maybe using something like De Morgan's laws to simplify first. Figure 3 shows these different hypothesized models.
And they ran De Morgan across the layers. Figure 4.
Yep. Similar story. Different layers seem to specialize. They focused their combination analysis on layer 10, where things started to look interesting, where different models showed varying levels of faithfulness.
So figure 5 shows the combination results for layer 10.
Right. And again, the pattern holds. Even with a smaller input space here, only 64 possibilities, the combined models achieve significantly higher strength than individual variable models at high faithfulness thresholds.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like combining a model for just representing one input, MX, with a model representing the negation of that input, MX, allows you to explain more inputs accurately than either model alone if you demand high faithfulness. Same for combining models representing inputs and operators.
So the combined approach seems generally useful.
The results strongly suggest so, yeah. At lower faithfulness thresholds, like around 0.8, the strength differences diminish because even the individual models can cover most inputs if you relax the accuracy requirement that much. But at the high end, where you really want trustworthy explanations, combination helps a lot.
Okay, so wrapping up the paper's conclusion.
They summarize it as a framework to tackle that strength-faithfulness trade-off. By combining simpler causal models that activate based on the input, they show experimentally you can get stronger, more comprehensive explanations while maintaining high faithfulness.
More accurate explanations for more of the network's behavior.
Precisely. And they suggest future work like scaling to harder tasks, maybe integrating this with other interpretability techniques, or using more sophisticated ways to find the best input partitions instead of just the greedy algorithm.
And the appendices had the nitty-gritty details on algorithms, training, data, etc.
Yep, all the technical specifics are there for those who want to dive really deep.
This feels like a really significant step. Connecting it historically, we've always tried to break down complex systems, right? From physics to biology.
Absolutely. And causal abstraction is sort of the latest tool in that long quest for simplified, understandable models of complicated things, especially for AI, where just looking at correlations doesn't tell you why something happens.
Like observational studies versus controlled experiments in medicine. Interventions are key.
And this whole challenge of faithfulness fits into the broader debate around explainable AI, or XAI. What even is a good explanation? This paper offers a concrete, quantifiable take on that for causal models.
So thinking about real-world impact, more reliable AI.
Potentially, yeah. If you can more accurately understand why an AI makes a decision, especially in critical areas like medicine or autonomous driving, you can trust it more. Or, crucially, identify when its reasoning is flawed.
Could it help with debugging or fixing biases?
I think so. If you can see that the network uses, say, algorithm A for this input subset and algorithm B for that subset, maybe you find algorithm B is biased or inefficient, you could then target interventions more precisely.
It's almost like how we humans switch mental models depending on the situation.
That's a great analogy. We don't use one single thought process for everything. We adapt. Maybe this is capturing a similar kind of flexibility in AI. It could be really useful for refining these big LLMs.
Okay, so the big takeaway is combining different explanations activated by different inputs looks like a very promising way to get more faithful, more informative interpretations of what's going on inside neural networks.
Exactly. Moving beyond one-size-fits-all explanations towards something more dynamic and nuanced.
Really fascinating stuff. For anyone wanting the full details, remember the link to the paper is available. Right. Let's shift gears to our novel notions segment. Where could this research lead next?
Okay, spinning off this idea of combined models. What if we use this to watch how capabilities emerge during LLM training?
How do you mean?
Like, could we track how the input space gets partitioned? See which simple causal models become actal and get combined as the model learns, say, arithmetic or coding, or even something complex like multi-hop reasoning.
So you're tracking the evolution of these combined explanations over training time.
Yeah. Maybe we could identify specific combinations of simpler algorithmic primitives like basic logic steps or pattern matchers that have to come together in a certain way for a complex skill to appear.
Like seeing how the ability to follow instructions might build up from simpler attention and sequence processing models combining in new ways.
Exactly that kind of thing. It could give us a developmental perspective on LLM abilities, building on work, looking at things like in-context learning development.
That's cool. Okay, my turn. What if we flipped it around and used, say, reinforcement learning to find the best set of base models and the best way to combine them automatically?
Ooh, interesting. So instead of us humans guessing the initial hypotheses.
Right. An RL agent explores the space of possible simple causal models and learns a policy for partitioning the input space and assigning models to maximize maybe a reward based on both strength and faithfulness.
So the agent would learn to discover the underlying computational structure. That's ambitious.
Yeah. Could it uncover completely non-intuitive ways the network breaks down problems? Maybe find internal algorithms we wouldn't even think to look for.
That would be amazing. Imagine discovering that a network uses like 5 different weird strategies for a task, switching based on tiny input variations, and the RL agent figures this out.
It could lead to a much more robust understanding, potentially revealing hidden failure modes or unexpected capabilities, and maybe inform how we design better architectures.
Definitely. If we understand the diverse computational strategies a network can learn, maybe we can design networks that learn them more effectively or are more adaptable. That's a really powerful idea.
Very speculative, of course.
Naturally. As always, these are just thoughts to provoke discussion, sparked by the paper.
The necessary disclaimer.
Yeah.
But it shows how this kind of foundational research can open up really exciting new questions.
It absolutely does. Lots to think about.
Well, that wraps up this deep dive. A huge thanks for walking us through that paper and exploring the possibilities. We hope this gave you some new insights into the quest to understand AI.
Always a pleasure. Until next time.
Catch you on the next one.